Well, hello everybody. I'm here with Steve Bass, and my name is Roger Green, and I'm the director of the Academy Sacred Geometry, and we host events all over the world, and we also do our Breakthru-Technologies with Dan Winter and Paul Harris. And for many years, I've been promoting the practical application of sacred geometry, as well as bioarchitecture. So I've known Steve for many, many years, and Steve has spent a couple of lifetimes on writing his latest book. Was this your first book?
My first book.
Your first book, right. And it's called Beauty, Memory, and Unity. And I'm going to start with interviewing Steve, and then Steve's going to take us through a presentation. So Steve,
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your background to begin with.
Well, I've been an architect for many years, since the early 70s, and I've been in practice here in New York City in a kind of personal way. And I began to look pretty early for a kind of methodology in design. How does one know what one is doing, or how can you evaluate your own work? You have to be your own critic for the most part in design. And I realized pretty quickly that the modern education that I'd gotten wasn't really up to that task. It hadn't really prepared me to analyze my own work.
Mm-hmm.
So I started to look for other authors, modern authors, and was not getting satisfying results. Finally, I turned to the ancient author Vitruvius, who lived in the 1st century AD, and was an acquaintance of Augustus Caesar.
Well, you just jumped straight into it, didn't you?
Well, I went back
into
to
the deep end.
Well, I went back to the beginning. Someone had told me, a teacher had told me at one point that if you really want to understand a subject, start at the beginning and read the comments later, read the later commentaries later, but start first at the beginning. So I finally went back and started at the beginning and found a method. Vitruvius had a method that was rational on the one hand, but was kind of holistic on the other hand. It allowed you kind of creative aspect. And I got very interested, and I started studying this method. And I found, well, Vitruvius is a very good author, but he can only take you about 90% of the way. He can't take you all the way through design to actually design something. And also his book has come down to us in kind of slightly difficult form. The illustrations had been lost, and the text had been somewhat corrupted, and so on. So there's a lot of things that we don't know about Vitruvius, but he has a method, and the method seemed to be very useful. When I read his method, he has a thing on designing temples. How do you design a temple? How do you design a temple front, at least, if not the whole temple? And looking at his method, I was able to reconstruct it, and without ever having touched any kind of classical architecture before. Within a few minutes, I was able to construct a credible portico.
Really?
And somebody came by the next day, or a little later, somebody came by who was not an architect, didn't have any training. And she's walking by my drawing board, and she stops, and I can hear a kind of, kind of inhalation, right? And she says to me, "Oh, that's beautiful." And so I knew I was on the right
sort of
track.
In a way, that got you really
and
fired up and got the passion going.
Absolutely. And then I realized that
in a way, you found your calling, perhaps.
Yeah, very definitely, because I was looking for a way that you could produce something that would get that kind of response in a predictable way. And here, this ancient man who'd been dead literally for 2,000 years had the method, right? And the modern people didn't seem to have it. So I got very interested in this, and I knew I needed to find a teacher to take me the other 10% of the way into the real details of this stuff. And I found a man named Alvin Home, who was an architect.
Oh, sure, I know Alvin. Yeah, I've met him a few times.
Yeah, and he's still around.
Hi, Alvin, if you're watching this.
Alvin, thank you. And Al was giving a course called Drawing the 5 Orders. In other words, how to draw ancient architecture in detail. And he was sponsored. He was here in New York at the National Academy of Design uptown, and he was sponsored by a fellow named Henry Hope Reed, who was a cultural critic, or critic of modernism, basically, and was the head of an organization called Classical America, which I subsequently became part of, or I joined up with.
And they're still going?
Classical America has later on merged with what's now called the Institute for Classical Architecture and Art.
Okay.
And
that's based here in New York,
that's based here in New York. And I've been involved with them for many years now, for almost 30 years. And they've really given me a lot of scope to develop some of these ideas. They're not themselves esotericists, they're architects and designers and historians and so on. But they've certainly given me a venue.
So then we both know Keith Critchlow.
Right.
And so tell us a little bit about, your work with...
he's the second half.
He's the second half, right.
Alvin showed me how to actually draw the orders. And in his presentation, he got it across that there was more going on here than meets the eye, that there was a mythological dimension, and that there was even a kind of a spiritual dimension to this work. And the other part of Vitruvius is that when he gives you this system for design, he tells you that he's getting it through Plato and Pythagoras. And so I realized I needed to find a teacher who understood Plato and Pythagoras in the sense of design and how to use them in design. And it was not going to be a regular academic person, because I had a little academic training in philosophy, and it was very dry stuff, and it was not, and they hated Plato anyway in the academy. I got told Plato was a fascist. And
right.
He'd have hippies like me arrested.
Right.
Run out of town. So that wasn't going to work. So eventually I found this fellow, Keith Critchlow, and Keith is a brilliant individual who is an architect, a painter, and a theorist, a philosophical theorist, and a Platonist, really.
And essentially it was Keith Critchlow and Jean-Michel, remember, who basically brought all of this back from the late 1950s onwards to, it was sort of the renaissance of the old English metaphysics and the cubic foot and the ley lines and all of that. And that he was sort of responsible for this, kind of being an inspiration to bring all of the old ancient arts that were totally forgotten.
Right.
This is the 1950s.
Right. And disrespected, really.
And disrespected.
And he brought them back into a kind of respectability. He and Michel and a few other people.
Sure.
In the circle, Kathleen Rain, who was involved with these guys, a brilliant poet and author. And so, and I had the privilege of working with Keith for a number of years. He was doing a series of summer workshops in Colorado, in Crestone, Colorado. Right. In association with Lindisfarne. And, at that time with William Irwin Thompson.
I wasn't around in those days, but sounds like fun to me.
It was very interesting. Keith had designed a little chapel, or I don't know what to call it even. It was a building designed for spiritual purposes. Out in Crestone, that was one of the most remarkable things that I'd ever seen, even to this day. It's a small thing, but it was built, rather than be built like a building, it was built like a musical instrument. And there were no metal fasteners in the building. It's all glued up wood. And the beams are laminated through one another as opposed to being separate. Anyway, it was a brilliant little building.
Right.
And I went there for a few years, and then, much to my surprise, Keith asked me if I wanted to study at the Royal College of Art in London. Now, I really didn't know who Keith was at this point. I just thought he was this interesting man who knew about Plato and obviously had some background in this stuff. And I was enjoying these workshops. But he was he had a department at the Royal College of Art, which is a very prestigious institution in London. Yeah. And he more or less invited me to come and study there.
What year was this, Steve?
This would have been 89. 1989. So it was through the 80s. I read Vitruvius in the late 70s. And then in the early 80s, I was studying with Alvin. And then in the later 80s, I was studying with Keith.
Has there been any other major influences on you since Keith's time?
Not really. It's basically those two folks, Alvin and Keith. And Alvin showed me what the system was. And then what Keith did for me was that he took me through some of the works of Plato, particularly the Timaeus and the Republic and a few other of parts of other dialogues that were relevant to this subject. And I began to see immediately that the descriptions of the classical architecture that I'd gotten from Alvin used number and geometry to set them up, to understand them.
Yeah.
And then from Keith, I learned that those numbers and geometries were part of the ancient philosophical system that Plato had gotten from Pythagoras and reworked into his own system.
Right.
And that basically Vitruvius had actually picked up on several centuries later. So it's from the crossing of those two guys that this book really came out, and this study really generated from those two guys.
Well, Steve, look, I've got some questions here from, you know, that have basically, some of them are mine, some of them are some colleagues, and we've even got some questions from our great leader, Ralph White, from the New York Open Center. And for those who don't know it, Ralph puts on a wonderful esoteric quest every year, esotericquest.org. And so let's get into it.
And Ralph has given me a number of opportunities also.
Yeah.
Thank him. Sure,
Okay, so the search for the beautiful. Can you tell more about the search? What is beauty? Why is it important?
What is beauty? Oh boy. Well, that's really the theme here. Is the idea of beauty. All right. Most commentaries. Thank you.
Beauty, memory, unity.
Yes. Most commentators I found in researching these ideas, most commentators will talk about beauty. They'll talk about its effects. They'll talk about certain ways you might be able to achieve it. But their tendency is not to talk about what it actually is. And it's, I think, because it's very difficult. So I found my way to the ancient Neo-Platonist Plotinus. Plotinus, I believe, was end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century AD. Like many wisdom teachers, he himself wrote nothing, but after his death, his work, his notes or work was collected by some of his students, and they were published as what's called the Aeneads, or the 9 books. And in one of those sections, it's just a series of subject statements. And in one of them, it's about visual beauty. And he goes through a whole argument, and he gets to the idea that beauty is, to say it the long way, beauty is a joyous state of the soul as it recalls its relationship to divine unity.
Nice.
Right? And unity is kind of a philosophical euphemism for the divine, for the divinity, what they call theos in ancient times. So I shortened that a little bit to the phrase beauty, memory, unity. Beauty is the memory of unity. And what does that really mean? Or what does that imply? That that the soul is based on the idea of the soul.
Well, that takes us to our next question here. Yes. You write about remembrance and the journey of the soul.
Yes.
Can you please elaborate?
Okay, I can elaborate. In the Platonic system, and which he probably got from Pythagoras, and it may have been pre-existing even before Pythagoras, because Pythagoras really sums up a lot of really ancient stuff, and then Plato reshapes it into our world's thing.
Right.
But the soul, it goes on a journey. The soul, the psyche, or what we would call either mind or consciousness even today, begins in a kind of divine realm that's associated in the ancient mind with the level of the fixed stars. There's a shell. The stars are considered a shell that surrounds us. And the soul begins in that realm, in a kind of divine realm. And it begins its journey as a ray of light, as a point of light, as one of our former presidents once said in his speech. Not my favorite president, but he used this image of 1,000 points of light, which is it's a Neo-Platonic idea of the soul's descent. So the soul descends for reasons that are a little complicated, which I won't go into here, but the soul begins to descend. It's kind of karma, it has to do with karma, but the soul descends and it goes through, and it's a purely divine entity at that point, a non-physical entity. And as it descends, it goes through the shells of the planets. Each of these 7 visible planets is considered to be on a shell or moving on a kind of a shell, an invisible shell, a crystal shell. and the soul descends through these shells. And depending on where a particular planet is in relation to the descent, the person or the person to be begins to take on a kind of character.
Mm-hmm.
So if a planet is squaring you, it has one relationship. If it's opposing you, it has another, etc.
Mm-hmm.
When it gets to the level of the moon, of course, the Earth is at the center in this view. So you go down through Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and then the moon. And when it gets to the moon, the psyche begins to take on physical characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
And when it reaches the Earth, it's physically born. That's the birth thing. But at the point of birth, the psyche has literally, as Plato says, been turned around, and it loses its knowledge of where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
It begins to identify with the body, as we say today.
Mm-hmm.
So it forgets what it is. And so for Plato, all knowledge is a form of remembrance, because when the psyche was in the divine realm, it shared the knowledge of the divine, which is the knowledge of everything,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. But when it descends into the body, it particularizes and it forgets. So the task of the person in life is to remember what you are and where you came from.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what Plato refers to as anamnesis, or not forgetting.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the task of the person. And so what I've tried to do actually is use the idea of beauty as a kind of anamnesis, because if beauty is the memory of unity, it's the memory, it's the reminder that we are starting in that divine realm.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can create an object of beauty, you will also at the same time create a desire, eros, if you will, an erotic desire to join with the object of beauty. Mm-hmm. We all share this in our physical lives and in our aesthetic lives as well. So it gives the designer a kind of a power on the one hand.
Wow, it's very interesting, Steve. It's such a big,
it's a huge thing. Yeah, I know, it's a huge idea.
And it really is that seed of spirituality and the quest for this, isn't it? That you're finding your path back to, to the source and back through the stars.
Yes.
Let's get down to, say, some of the tangible things with this. For instance, symbolic number is an integral part of the path of sacred geometry and architecture.
Yes.
How does it work?
Well, the Pythagoreans had three kinds of number.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There was quantitative number, excuse me, or a number of things that you can count. Those are fairly obvious. The second category was what we call mathematical number.
Mm-hmm.
Arithmetic, and things like arithmetic and geometry and so on, where number is abstracted into a magnitude and a series of operations. Now those are strictly logical operations, but there's a third, and that's the number that we're all familiar with, is mathematical number.
But the third is when it really comes alive, isn't it? Where they're living entities in a way.
Right, it's called qualitative number, or what I call symbolic number, where number, it's not, in other words, instead of talking about three, you would talk about the quality of threeness. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be three? Mm-hmm. And it becomes a symbolic entity at that point. Mm-hmm. This is where vitality can enter. Mm-hmm. One of the problems in modern architects and designers or artists trying to integrate mathematics, a lot of people have the feeling that there's something going on here, and they're correct. There is a relationship, but they try to use number mathematically in the arts. And when you do that, you can't create a vital entity. It's and you usually the result is usually very stiff and dead and unpleasant. So you have to go to the symbolic. So that's the relationship there.
Mm. Something that we've really lost, but I think sacred geometry has really brought that back into our lives.
Well, it's the beginning of it. Yeah, that's the beginning of the study of this.
So what's meant by proportion in the arts?
Well, proportion to me is the use of number and geometry in the symbolic mode as a guide to designing an actual object.
Right.
And a lot of the book deals with methods that you can actually apply to use. Basically, I think there are three methods, or three that seem to appeal, that seem to come up to me. You can use a system of arithmetic counting. So you can divide a facade, for example, into a grid. This is what Vitruvius does. He divides, he says, take the facade and divide it into a certain number of parts. And then a certain number of those parts give you the height of the columns. And then you take a portion of that and it becomes the entablature and so on. So that's the arithmetic method. You can use pure geometry. So things like the square root of 2 or the square root of 3 or the golden section or the square root of 5 can be used directly. And we'll see that in some of the slides coming up.
Sure.
And then there's a third method, which I call the harmonic ratio method. It was always there, but it comes really into fruition in the Renaissance with the work of somebody like Palladio, the famous Renaissance architect Palladio, who gave certain better ratios or ratios that he felt would give you the best proportions.
What were they, for instance?
Well, they go back to the musical octave for one thing, and then into certain rationalizations of transrational numbers. In other words, if you take a number like the square root of 2, for example, that's not actually a number. It's a relationship.
Yep.
And it's what's in mathematics they call it a transcendental, or sometimes they call it an irrational, which I don't term which I don't use because it's a pejorative. But you can call it a transcendental. I call it a transrational because it includes the rational but goes beyond. So how do you actually work with something like the square root of 2? You can draw it, right, and you can get an exact place for it. But in practical terms, you really can't do that if you're building a building or something. You really can't draw the root 2 on a surface. It's usually impractical to do that. So you have to rationalize it. So if the square root of 2 is equal to, let's say, 1.414, a transcendental. So what does that mean? If you have a rectangle that's 10 by 14, that's pretty close to 1 to the square root of 2. Okay. So you could also say 5 to 7 if you want to get it a little smaller.
Right.
So that's the harmonic ratio method. So this is what Palladio does. He gives you the 4 basic musical ratios, which are 1 to 1 for the fundamental, 1 to 2 for the octave, or I should say 2 to 1 for the octave, 3 to 2 for the fifth, for the perfect fifth, and 4 to 3 for the perfect fourth. So those are whole number ratios. Then he takes a number like the square root of 2, and he gives you 5 to 7, right? And then he takes the golden section, which is 1 to 1.618, and he gives you 5 to 8.
Right.
So what I mean by the harmonic ratio method is this rationalization of the transrationals and their fusion with the rational ratios, and it becomes a system that you can use and apply in a very direct way, and you don't have to do anything arcane or
tell me, Steve, when was the golden section first mentioned in the classics? Do you know?
Well, it's mentioned in Plato. That's probably the first written example in the West, but and again, this gets controversial, because most scholars don't want to accept the idea that if something isn't written down, that it actually existed. So if you go back to Egyptian times, for example, you find that their projects are just covered with the golden section. I mean, it's just all over the place.
Now, wouldn't you say that about all of the ancient world?
I would say it about a lot of things, yeah. I know I've looked at Egypt particularly. I haven't, for example, looked at Mesopotamian architecture. There's less known about that. I haven't looked at Chinese architecture and so on. But you do find it in India to some extent.
Well, they use the golden section for the design of the Forbidden Palace.
Okay, well, I'm sure I'm sure they did. I'm sure the Japanese use it as well. This is something that it's a very fundamental ratio of the golden section. It's definitely a principle of sacred geometry, and to me, it's a mathematical metaphor for the return to unity through multiplicity. And I have a demonstration of this in the book. I don't have it on the slides here today, but you can actually geometrically demonstrate that the golden section returns you to unity through multiplicity.
Well, I agree with that,
And that's why it's a very important ratio and won't go away. Again, it's right there in Egypt. It's found in building after building. I followed the work of a fellow named Alexander Badaway, who was kind of, I don't want to say renegade, but he was an unorthodox Egyptologist and has been criticized a lot. but yet you can't deny that these ratios are there.
Oh, absolutely.
And I do go through his work in my book, and you can see it. So that's the earliest that we know of. I'd say is ancient Egypt, and but I'm sure it goes back into the Paleolithic.
Well, in the modern age, the golden mean ratio now is, the most cutting edge of physics and for instance, another colleague of ours, Scott Olson, has written a book. Scott Olson, his book on the golden mean ratio, and of course, even colleagues of mine, Dan Winter and Paul Harris, have used the golden mean ratio to get two plasma bubbles, with strong. It's the only ratio you can use to bring it. Oh yeah, yeah. Well, it's, as you beautifully put it, it's the only principle for agreement of all the waves to come together and to materialize too.
It's the only one that you can just follow all the way through. Yeah, and it's always the same. It's always
to collapse it or to expand it.
Right. The other ratios have harmonic effects, but it's not as intense as the golden section. So, yeah.
So why is the book focused on pre-modern architecture? Doesn't modern architecture use the same principles?
Well, I would say no. The short answer would be no. These principles, part of the problem we have today with these Platonic principles is that they don't make any sense unless you presume that the universe is a single entity to which we're all connected, and that ultimately has a divine basis. Now,
so what do you mean by they won't make sense, though, in the modern sense? What do you mean by that? In the modern sense, you're saying that they're not going to make sense, the Platonic.
The modern world is, in many ways, the inverse or the turning inside out of the ancient world. And a lot of the principles that we use in modernism are opposite to the ones that are used in classicism or traditional work. So, whereas...
that I know, but you said they're not going to make sense in the modern world.
Because the modern world is materialist and reductionist.
But when you do use these principles, you start to create beauty and harmony in architecture again, surely.
Well, then the question would be kind of, where is it?
Hard to find in the modern world.
The problem is you can't find it, really.
You find it in the architects are into sacred geometry and Michael Rice and the whole...
Well, they're trying. Yeah, Michael Rice is trying. I've seen some of his work. They're trying. People are trying. But the mainline architecture, the architecture that's taught in school, the architecture that gets the publicity, the starchitects and so on, go the opposite way.
Okay.
And there's almost a kind of a cult of ugliness. If you take somebody like Rem Koolhaas, for example, he talks about his own work as junk. Like crap, basically, right? That's what he's referring to his own work.
You just start to get used to, and it just becomes.
Yeah, it's just something. It's a throwaway. It's going to be. We're going to throw it away at the end of the mortgage. It'll be thrown away. So why do anything substantive? Why do anything that's really going to give people that sense of unity that I'm talking about here? You don't need it. You have this fellow. What's his name? I'm blocking his name. Who did, he has an architecture that he calls shards and splinters. I'm forgetting his name, I'm sorry.
Well, we'll come back to it.
Okay, but that's the kind of thing, because the world is bleeped up. So we're going to do an architecture that is disharmonious, intentionally disharmonious.
Well, it's sort of symbolic of where we are, isn't it? Where humanity is.
Yeah,
it's only just a reflection of,
Absolutely. So this is part of the problem, and those, one of the things about physics, for example. Now I'm not a physicist and I can't do the math, so I'm limited here. But they've come up against a problem, a serious problem, which is that they have to find a way back to unification, but they can't really because they're in a reductionist mode. Right? So this is a big problem, and they're going to have to make a breakthrough. Somebody's going to have to make a breakthrough somewhere. I don't know how they're going to do it in physics, but I know this study that I've done is an attempt to do it in architecture.
Interesting.
Right? So because you're going to have to change the definitions. Science is going to have to get off of reductionism to a certain extent, and later
Let's hope so.
You'll see. Well, I'm going to refer to Goethe later.
Right.
He was the last non-reductionist scientist in the West.
Right.
So he's one way out, possibly. But the, you know, so on the one hand, the scientists are going to have to accept that there's maybe things that they can't fully describe.
Yeah.
Right. Because right now, one of the myths of science is that we can describe everything mathematically, but you can't, because you can't describe the square root of 2. It's an unending sequence. So it implies that there's a horizon, there's like an event horizon that we can't see over. And so the scientists are going to have to back off hard reductionism. And the artists, on the other hand, are going to have to back off complete freedom, because in the classical sense, freedom is defined by the limit.
Yeah.
Right. And artists today don't want to accept limits.
Yeah.
But again,
or the discipline.
Or any discipline, right. But if there's going to be any kind of integration, then both of those sides are going to have to back off their hard positions, so to speak. And that's a real challenge for us. I don't know when it's going to happen. I think it will happen at some point.
Well, you know, when things reach their, you know, extreme, they always start to, in a way, come back to balance. What periods of history and culture have embodied the beautiful most successfully in your view?
Well, I'd say the further back you go, the better. If you could go back to ancient Egypt, you know, there was a culture that was just purely based on magic. I mean, there was no ifs, ands, or buts.
Right.
The universe was a magical creation, and you lived in that world of magic, and you prepared for it, and you dealt with it, and everything was completely harmonious. Now, on the other hand, the early societies don't share the same idea of the individual that we do. But again, that's part of this idea of reductionism and materialism, that we can somehow separate ourselves. So again, there's going to have to be some kind of merger there, where we accept maybe a little that we're not completely free individuals, that we are parts of something larger. But I would say go as far back as you can, and it gets better and better the further back you go. It's kind of a Platonic idea as well, because of course.
Well, that takes us to this last question.
Okay,
how can architecture be a source for the elevation of the soul and the remembrance of the sacred?
Well, I think in art and architecture, in aesthetics generally, you have to use these earlier principles. People are going to have to study these earlier principles. It's these Pythagorean and Platonic ideas. And they're just going to have to try to integrate them into contemporary life. And I don't, you know, I'm only one person. I've tried. This book represents my attempt to do that. But everybody's going to have to work on this for themselves. And my hope for this book, for example, is that it's going to wind up on some library shelves or in people's libraries. And
so, where do you want to take it from here? You know, how do you see the next 5 years for you personally?
For myself personally, well, I hope to keep teaching. I still teach at the Institute for Classical Architecture. I hope to keep doing that. And I would hope to keep working along these same themes and giving presentations on this kind of work and developing some of these ideas further. You know, I would like to build. I haven't really had as many opportunities as I'd like. I guess I'm just the kind of person who delves more into theory than into practice.
So if you were given sort of an architectural task, you would embody a lot of this into the project?
I certainly would
try. They're the only projects that you're kind of interested in?
Well, you have to try to make it what I would call an integration.
Yeah, sure.
You don't.
We live in the real world.
Yeah. But you know, one of the rubrics about the classical, or one of the canards, as they say, is that that the classical is copying. It's what they call slavish copying. But that isn't really what it is. It's a study. You have to study these elements so that you integrate them. But once you integrate them, you have to modify them. You can't, in other words, the elements are like ideas. They're disembodied, and they live in a kind of the poetic universe. Right. But in order to use them, you got to bring them down into the world. Whenever you bring something down into the world, it's, you know, the ideas don't change, but the physical world constantly changes. So you've got to modify the ideas to bring them down. But you can't do that properly unless you understand them first, unless you, what I call, integrated them first. So you have to study the element, as an architect, I'm just speaking, you have to study the elements, and then you have to try to apply them to your contemporary situation in ways that make sense. And I think in the end that you can use the elements themselves to kind of tell you what they want to be, or how they want to be used. And the hope would be, I don't know if this will happen in my time or anybody's time in the near future, but that there would be a kind of an architecture that integrates these essential principles, the classical principles, the classical elements, the sacred geometries, with contemporary life in a positive way.
Sure.
And it won't be pure classical.
Well, you know, we've got sustainability now, and the whole eco-design dynamics,
yes,
and all of that coming together.
I'm really thinking visually here, rather more than sustainability to me is almost a kind of engineering function. How do you shape the thing, and how kind of
what materials,
kind of equipment, and so on.
And also the energy efficiency and
but this to me, this is a kind of engineering. Yeah. So it's not aesthetic because you can't see it. You can't see sustainability. But as far as what you can see, there would need to be an integration, again, of these ancient forms and ideas brought down into the contemporary world. And I'm not exactly sure what that would look like. I would like to have the opportunity to find out more and more. I've tried a few times, mostly entering competitions and so on.
Right.
But
well, Steve, we'll switch gears a little bit here. I'm going to just go here and share the screen a little bit. Give me a second, folks, just to get my act together here. We've got this wonderful little presentation here. And let's go to share the screen. The desktop. And here we are here, and we'll go into our presentation. So this is your advanced key there.
Okay, well, this is the cover of the book, and it just shows the. Let's see, how do I? If I can I get this thing? Is that will that photograph or is that?
I don't know.
It's too bad.
Maybe, yeah. I don't know.
And if I can't actually touch it right now. Okay,
no.
So that's a little. Usually I can point at these things with my laser pointer, but I don't have it. Well, here on the cover, there's the three scales, right? There's the macrocosm with the galaxy, the microcosm with the plant, and the human mesocosm spanning between them, guided by the same geometrical pattern. Here, in this case, the golden section spiral. All right, so that's the cover. How do I? Oh, it's this.
Folks, just so you know, you'll see down in our text that we'll put the link to. It's available on Amazon.
On Amazon, books. Okay. So it's this. It's this guy.
Here we go, Steve. Coming into being.
All right. So the book is divided into 4 parts. There's a famous Pythagorean symbol called the tetractys, which is 4 stages. It's 10 dots in 4 levels, right? And so I divided the book into 4 stages. The first part is the theory. And the theory, it goes back to Plato and Pythagoras, that the coming into being of an orderly cosmos can be modeled on these 4 stages, like the tetractys. So you have unity, which is undifferentiated. The unity divides from within to form a duality, but the duality is unstable. And so in order to stabilize it, you have to add a 3rd element, which is the triad or the trinity, as you might call it, right? So the first manifestation is usually thought as a trinity.
It's a bit like the Tao creates yin and yang, and then out of that,
creates everything else. Yeah. And so, but then there's a final stage. If you think of it geometrically, unity is the point, division is the line, the triad is the plane, and then you need a 4th stage, which is the tetrad or the crossing, which is the solid, the physical manifestation.
North, south, east, west.
Right, the whole 4 corners of the earth. So, and these are also, they represent the 4 mathematical subjects of Plato called the quadrivium. And this was Critchlow's formulation of it. Arithmetic, number and concept; geometry, number and space; music, number and time; astronomy, number in space and time. And in this system, beauty is, I'm defining it as the memory of unity, and it's the descent with these 4 stages are the descent, right, from the one into the multiplicity. And then I think, is it this one? Yeah. And and this gives rise to this idea of the soul in Plato, the psyche. And as I say, the idea of proportion really only makes sense if there's a single orderly cosmos that, as Plato says, is endowed with life and intelligence. The outer circle here is theos, or the divine, or the one, or the containment. These are just different ways of expressing these ideas philosophically. The upper circle, this upper inner circle, is the circle of ideas, of disembodied forms, or a form without body. And the lower circle is called Hule, which is matter without form, or chaotic matter, as it's described in the Bible. The earth was without form and void, and so on. Right. And then the third circle there is the individual psyche. Okay. So the outer circle is kind of the world psyche, or the cosmic psyche, and then the individual psyche balances the nous and the Hule. As they say in the books, the nous is projected through the psyche into matter, and the orderly cosmos that we see arises as a result of that impression of the nous into matter. And in this one, this was for a particular presentation. It has the imagination shown in there.
Yeah, it's nice. It's a good place to put it, isn't it?
Well, imagination, it has nothing to do with fantasy. That's our problem today. Imagination is the gateway between the nous and the Hule. It's the nous comes through the imagination and gets particularized before it gets projected actually into matter. So this is the Platonic psyche, and you notice that the individual psyche, the inner circle, and the world psyche, the outer circle, not only are similar forms, but they're concentric. They're on the same center. Okay. And that center is the kind of Christic possibility, right? The remembrance. You can remember it because of that phenomenon, geometrically expressed. Right. So that's what that kind of means. So let's see if we can keep going. So now what they actually studied in the ancient world, the primary means of study to recall the sense of unity was actually music or harmony. And so here's a geometrical diagram that comes from Claudius Ptolemy, and I think in the 2nd century BC or something like that, in Alexandria. And he is a diagram called the helicon. That lower triangle there is supposed to look like Mount Helicon, where Apollo governs the Muses, right? And it's basically a square divided by a diagonal, and the other figure is called the semi-diagonal, the other line that goes from the center of the top down to the bottom corner. It's called the semi-diagonal. And that gives you the relationship of the 4 fundamental tones in ancient music. And you see them here: the fundamental, the octave, the 5th, and the 4th. Right. And then on the right side here is my rendering of it into architecture. Very nice. So you can use this exact geometrical
music and architecture
form, right? And this is called a musical analogy.
As the Indians say, architecture is just frozen music.
Well, that was Goethe, actually. They say in India too, I'm sure. That was Goethe, actually, who said that. So, and that's why I use him as a reference later on. So here it is. Nice. So there's one portico. And then in terms of the second section, well, that's so much for the theory. The second part of the book is kind of a workbook, in which the hope is that architects and designers will actually draw these things. And I mean draw them by hand.
Well, that's something that, we really encourage people to do. I mean, Keith Critchlow's workshops, remember? There'll be about 7 days of just drawing. And of course there'll be, dialogue, but, it's like getting it into your bones. It's really experiencing those beautiful ratios and what you can do with it.
It's very important because drawing is what I call psychophysiological. In other words, it goes through the mind and the body. Yeah. You got to see it. It's got to come in. Something's got to come in. It's got to get processed, and it's got to go down the nerve, and it's got to come out in the hand. So you're using the whole body. Yeah. This is another point of Critchlow's, that you learn with the whole body, not just with mind.
Well, the Academy Sacred Geometry has put on, the Sacred Geometry celebration.
Yes.
We don't do it every year, but it's always been a strong theme of the, drawing and actually making the shapes. And,
yes. But it has to come physically out.
You've got a whole sort of, workbook, practical workbook embedded in the book.
And in this illustration, the idea here is that the whole and the part, that is to say, the portico, the portico itself is drawn with the same geometrical diagram that we saw in the musical illustration. And it's also the capital of the column can also be drawn on the same geometrical diagram. Okay. So the whole and the part are related harmonically.
It's like a big fractal, isn't it?
It's a fractal, yes. It's a fractal construction. And you can continue in this down many levels. And that's part of, again, this is something that classical architecture has that modern architecture has lost.
Yeah.
They just don't do that. They stop at the big thing. And the buildings lack something. The buildings just lack something, yeah. So, and classical architecture, so that's a classical principle that could be brought into the modern age.
Nature's doing it all the
time. And that's why we find it so beautiful. But again, this is something that if it could be integrated into the modern sensibility, architecture would get better. Right? All right, so we have that. So here's another one. Right, a different kind of portico. There are an indefinite number of porticos that you can do with these methods. This is a particularly interesting one because it uses the pentagram. And I'm very fascinated with this one, yeah. And then the part, if we go back, let's see if we can go back. Yeah, well, I can't point to it, but the column capital.
We'll see. We'll put the cursor over here.
Okay, you're right. The column capital, and then
here we are. Here, that's what you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. So then, if we go forward, that is designed on the same thing. It's the squaring of the circle with the pentagram.
This is what you've actually specialized in a lot.
Oh yeah,
the relief work, like in the classical sense.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. This is in order to prove the system. So, and what I did what I do in my own work is that I start with a blank sheet. See, there's a test. You can analyze something and feel that you found a method or a geometrical construction. But then can you reproduce it? The test is, can you use it to reproduce that element, right? And can you reproduce it all the way down?
So you've got several scales. The circle here too.
So you've got the squaring of the circle and the pentagram, and there's an inverted pentagram in there. It looks a little complicated. Here again is the whole and the part.
Well, it looks complicated, but once you practice this a little bit,
once you draw it a couple of times, right? And in the book, the book goes through the steps, right? The book goes through step by step, and there's text, of course, that's guiding you through this. So so that's the workbook section, and I go through the various elements of classical architecture in that way. So now, then there's a long history part, and the history part, I struggled with the history part because there's a tremendous story to tell here, and you can't tell it all. You just can't do it all. So I had to really strip it down. Very much, but
maybe the next book just elaborates a bit further.
Well, I hope, or parts of it in articles or whatever. So this is
So what did you come up with stripping it down?
Well, just through a series of examples and a kind of outline of what happened during a certain period, or what was Egypt, where was it, when was it? Most people don't know these things anymore. So what was it, where was it, when was it? How long, for example, it lasted? The Egyptian civilization lasted 10 times the length of American civilization so far. 10 times. I mean, wow, that's a lot of time to explore stuff, right? And anyway, and so on. But and then the history gets more particular about what happens later on in the Renaissance, and particularly after the Renaissance and what's called the Enlightenment, because that's where we lose the system. And I go into some detail about how the system got lost.
Okay.
Because I think it's important for people to know these things so they know it just didn't happen by accident. Yeah, it's a very interesting story.
We'll just wait for the movie to come out.
I'd love to do the movie, but we'll see. So this is Akhenaten's temple at Amarna, his capital, and you can see on the left is the plan of the building with some line work on it. In the center is an Egyptian method that I got from this fellow Badaway, which is known as the pillar, and it's a series of triangles. So here you see the same, there's a square, A, B, C, D, and then there's the semi-diagonal EC, right? Line EC, for example, or ED is a semi-diagonal. So it's the same figure that we saw in the previous slides. And here it's being used to create a series of triangular pillars, as he calls them. I don't know what the Egyptians would have called them, but they call pillars. And you get, for example, line FG gives you the facade of the pylon. And HJ gives you the back of the hypostyle hall. Yeah.
And then what the...
And then this is a linear method that would have been more maybe Greek or Roman style method.
Right.
So, and it's partly the idea is that there are many ways to look at these things. There isn't just one way. One of the problems that I found in researching these things is that a lot of the earlier authors on these subjects felt that they had found the answer, right? But there is no the answer. There is an answer that has some appropriateness. And there could be many answers that have various levels of appropriateness. So there could be many methods. So this is the Egyptian method in the middle, and then a kind of a more modern or Greek or Roman method on the other side there, right? So, and then the Greek work itself. Now I couldn't, so much has been written about Greece that I kept it very light.
A lot of books on that.
Yeah, there's so much on that. So here again, there's at the top you see a step-by-step illustration, and then at the bottom I put in the actual portico, the actual temple portico. But this is called the Hephaestion. It's a temple at Athens that was dedicated to Hephaestus, who was the divinity of artisanship, very appropriate for architecture. And in this case, the colonnades, from the along the ground, DC here. Let's see if I can find this here. DC. And then up to K here, between K and J. This is the colonnade is in what's called it's in what's called a root 5. Let me go back a little bit. It's what's called a root 5 rectangle. And again, it's explained in the text and all. And then there's a series of steps that can actually give you the rest of the building. And at the bottom, there's a scale that is a double Fibonacci series, right? The Fibonacci series is a series of phi related numbers, the whole numbers. So, and it goes 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. And what is it? 13. So here's a double Fibonacci series, which is very interesting, that you use to get what are called the triglyphs and metopes up in the upper part of the what's called the entablature there. So it's a double method actually. You can use geometry and you can use arithmetic, but the arithmetic is guided by the golden section. Both of them are guided by the golden section. So they become two different ways of achieving the same sense of unity, right? So this is the idea of that, and here's the plan of the Hephaestion, again, with a geometrical method that the Greeks themselves might have used, or with an Egyptianized method, which they could also have used because the Greeks learned a lot about construction in Egypt. They were there from the 6th century and the 7th century onwards, helping them fight the Persians and so on. Rome, again, Rome is a vast thing, and I had to really keep it down, This is the Pantheon, which is the great seminal building by Hadrian, 2nd century AD. It's a huge story, and this particular construction is something that I go into in the text. It's a phi construction. It's a series of expanding phi triangles. The Egyptians, I think, used it. I do a study of Hatshepsut's temple, which I think used it. And in this case, I'm saying I don't know that Hadrian did it. See, again, I'm not saying here that this is the way that they did it, even at the time. What I'm suggesting is that this is a method that you could use to reconstruct something that has that sensibility, that has that vitality. Right. I'm not trying to prove that anybody did anything 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. I don't know what anybody is thinking now. I don't know what you're thinking now. I mean, so how can I know what somebody was thinking 2,000 years ago, or even who designed this? There's a lot of controversy as to whether Hadrian actually designed it.
Sort of decoded it to a good degree.
To a certain extent, I think I'm close, right? But the test is always reconstruct the building. Start with a blank sheet of paper and reconstruct it, and see if this method actually gives you the building. And in this case, I think it comes very close. I wouldn't have published these things. Obviously, I did many studies of these things, and if they didn't come close, I'd pass them by and went on, right? The Middle Ages.
Would you say that's the first time that's been done, Steve?
It's the first time that I've seen it. Now, others may have done it, and I may just not have seen it. But it's an approach that I took that I think is kind of unique, And I think it's a modern approach. I think it's a contemporary approach because it's not dogmatic. It's not trying to find the answer, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are some very interesting books that are often quoted.
You're very humble in your approach there.
Well, I think you have to be because it's a vast subject. So anyway, this is Chartres, good old Chartres Cathedral, and it uses what's called ad triangulum here. I'm getting this from a man named John James, who was Keith actually put me onto him.
Right.
And this is his analysis. But one of the interesting things here is that the plan and the elevation are drawn on the same drawing. Now, this is something, if a good classical building.
Interesting, isn't it?
It's a good, well, of course, that's the maze. The rose window is the maze on the floor that you can stand it up.
Did you do the workshop with Keith Critchlow at Chartres? Did you?
I went to Chartres with Keith.
Yeah, I went to one of them. I think he did 2 or 3 of them. I went to the very last one.
He visited a number of times. Yeah, this was, I think I went to 1 or 2 times before that. But no, he was just wonderful.
A magical experience.
Totally. Oh, I agree. I just agree with him. It's just oh my God, it just didn't end. You know, and you know, one of the things that happened when I was actually in Chartres with Keith we were there for like 4 or 5 days.
Yeah.
And at one point there was a partial eclipse, right, where the moon passed partly in front of the sun, and it created.
If he planned it that way, huh?
It created the Vesica Pisces shape. Yeah. And here, this building, of course, fits in the Vesica Pisces. Yeah. And it was just this incredible thing of like, you know, you're on the right track because here's this teacher is telling you this stuff, and the elements of the universe actually line up to show you that image. And you say, wow, you know, this guy's keyed in something, man. I'm in the right place at the right time. Yeah, and it's that feeling. So here's Chartres, but you can draw it.
A great group of people too. You know?
Oh, always with Keith, with Keith, top drawer people. So I was very proud to be accepted actually into that realm. But the idea here is that the plan and the elevation and even the section through the building, if it's truly using these proportional methods, they can be drawn on top of one another and they make sense.
Yeah,
they all fit on the same thing. And I have a number of those in the book. Okay. So that's one. Then we get to the Renaissance, and I'm going to pass by some of the early Renaissance people. This is Palladio, who was later Renaissance. And this is a construction that I got from Rachel Fletcher, who was another person in the Critchlow orbit, who teaches at New York School of Interior Design, I think, and also at the ICA sometimes. So she's very good, and I got this one from her. This is, again, Route 5 construction. It's be too difficult to point out. But again, the plan and the elevation can be drawn on the same geometrical diagram. So it's really an amazing thing. And even these incredible Baroque wedding cakes. This is in Rome. This is a church called Santa Susanna by Carlo Maderno. Maderno later went on to do the facade of the Vatican. A wedding cake, yeah, Baroque wedding cake. That's what they look like. They're just these incredible wedding cakes. But even they can be reduced to some basic principles. And I think this is the goal. This is phi. The central opening between the 2 inner columns is, I think it would be phi cubed or something of the overall width of the building. It's a phi relationship. Okay. And it just goes on and on. So, and then you have to get arithmetic about it there on the bottom. There's the scale, because the way you get these Baroque things is that you begin to kind of dance the columns around and you move them slightly in one direction or another and so on. So that's what that's about. And I leave it in the 18th century, in the late 18th century, and I bring it home, so to speak, with Jefferson at the library here at UV. And here you can see he's, most people will say, well, he's quote, copying the Pantheon, but he's not really copying it, okay? It's his own building. He's using the overall motif, but he's proportioning it his own way. It's different than the Pantheon. If we had them together, you can see that. And again, he's using arithmetic. You can see on the left that he's actually working on graph paper. That's Jefferson's drawing. And he's working on graph paper. So he's definitely using a kind of arithmetical method, which would have been appropriate for the 18th century. Again, rationalism had taken over at that point. But look at the actual numbers that he's using are all golden section related approximations. So the whole thing relates on a golden section basis. And it's one of the reasons we find it so satisfying. All right, so, and a lot else. So then there's a small fourth part of the book, which deals with the present moment. Again, I had to restrain myself because the thing was getting too big. And I could have written a lot on any of these things. But the idea is, how do we escape? And that's the question that you asked at the end. How do we get back to something, or how do we find, where do we go from here, so to speak? and to get away from the alienation, the anxiety, the terror, the ugliness, right, and return to something that we can all believe in and enjoy again, right? Mm-hmm. And there are various pathways. We can study the Platonic system, as I've done. I try to steep myself in it, so that's a good way to do it.
A really good place to start.
It's definitely a good place to start. You can go in. You can study
Goethe.
It's
such a shame that the classics aren't taught anymore in schools.
Well, they're not. They're worse than not taught. They're demeaned. You're a paternalistic, chauvinist, imperialistic bleeper. Mother bleeper or whatever. If you want to go into these things, it's unfortunate. And I've gotten some of that criticism, but there are ways you can argue around it. So you can go to Plato directly. Mm-hmm. You can go to Goethe. Goethe is a little harder to approach, but there's a lot of writings on him. Mm-hmm. And of course, he's the basis for Steiner and anthroposophy. And so there's still
Steiner was the editor of all of those manuals.
I think he edited Goethe, did he not? Yeah. I believe he did. Yeah. Oh, and also
head of the library there for a decade, I think.
Right, right. And he names his architecture after Goethe, the Goetheanum and so on. And also, I'm throwing in here my own personal experience of what I call shamanic journeying. And I had the privilege of working with a fellow named Michael Harner, who was a teacher of what you might call contemporary shamanism. Mm-hmm. He was an anthropologist who studied with people in South America, with the native indigenous groups in South America. Okay. And he began to participate. He sort of violated the prime academic rule of reductionism, which is that he participated. Because they told him, he was trying to figure out what was going on in the spiritual practices. And finally, the shaman tells him, look, if you want to understand this, you got to go on the journey with me, and I'll take you on the journey, right? Mm-hmm. And this involved certain substances, which we don't use, right, which are illegal in the United States, but not in Peru or where they were doing this.
Right.
And so he went on the journey, and he found out what it was about, and he was very impressed. And
did he write some books on that?
He has two books. He has one is called The Way of the Shaman, and the other is called Cave and Cosmos. Okay. And he recently passed away. I think just at the beginning of the year, he passed away sadly. But he was a brilliant man, and I only worked with him very briefly. But it was almost a kind of life-changing experience to make the journey with him, and to experience how easy it was. Of course, in the workshops, this was a workshop in the United States here, and of course you can't use any of those substances that they use in Peru because they're illegal. So he just uses the drum. Okay. Right. And there are many shamans all over the world who just use the drum. They don't use any substances. Yeah. So you don't need it. You don't actually need them. The substances are tools that can shape the journey, right? But the journey itself can be done without it. You have to get the mind into a different category. And in Native America, a lot of times they use stress factors. So the famous, they would pin you up from the pectorals, whatever. Right. Or I knew some guys out west who did what they call the sun dance, which is where you just go around in a circle until you just literally fall on the floor and hallucinate.
Right.
And you don't eat, you don't drink, you don't stop. Yeah, right. And they had actually done this and stuff. So, but you can treat, and what happens on the journey is that you meet spirit helpers. Right, you're going there for a reason. You're making the journey for a reason. You're asking a question, and you're going to find help if you're well-intentioned, if you're properly intentioned. You're going to find help. The spirits are going to help you. You're going to show themselves to you in certain ways. So I realized that you could treat the elements of architecture, like that Corinthian capital, for example, that we were looking at with the pentagram. You could treat that as a spirit helper, right? Because it doesn't exist. Where does that exist? I mean, it exists in a noetic realm, you might say, right? Like the spirits, and like the bear or the buffalo or whatever it's going to be, or the plant, and so on. And you can approach these things in spirit, and they will tell you, just like the plant will tell you that whether you can use it to heal a certain aspect. You're going there for somebody who's ill, and the plant will say, okay, if you make a tea, chop up my leaves and make a tea and give it to the person, and it'll help bring back the centeredness of the person. These elements will actually speak to you if you can integrate them enough. If you can get in the spirit with them, they will integrate with you. So that could be a method as well. Sure. That could take us somewhere from here. But whatever path we travel, I would say, the world, in a sense, is going to have to be reunited, re-spiritualized, re-enchanted. And in terms of Goethe, the sorcerer will have to return. Goethe, of course, is the author of this famous myth called The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And in the Disney, I've got an image of the Disney version there where Mickey is giving him back the hat. But you know what happens in The Sorcerer's Apprentice is the sorcerer goes away and he tells the apprentice to mop the floor. And the apprentice says, oh no, I'm too good to mop the floor. So I've seen the sorcerer animate things, right? So he animates the broom or animates the mop or whatever. But then he can't stop the mop. He doesn't know how to finish it. So the mop, and so in his desperation, he chops up the mop. And then he's got a dozen mops that are coming at him now, and they're threatening to wash him away completely. Well, finally, the sorcerer returns and puts a stop to it. And here Mickey is being, very humble, giving him back the hat, right? The symbol, yeah. And don't get me started on Disney. That's a whole other world. But the captivation of the American imagination, But we live in a sorcerer's apprentice world, very much so. And the examples I always think of first are things like, Fukushima, for example. I mean, there's an example of how you can turn the powers on, but you can't turn them off. Or Chernobyl, you can turn the powers on, but you can't turn them off, right? And that thing is, the thing in Japan is irradiating the whole Pacific Ocean, and they can't shut it off. They can't stop they can't cool the plutonium down, or whatever it was, with the uranium. And it's just going to keep irradiating for generations, basically, and nobody knows exactly what to do with it. So we're going to have to get out of this kind of thing where we live in this sorcerer's apprentice world, because it's very dangerous, and it's in the most inherent way possible, or in the most extraordinary way possible, it's not sustainable, right? We can't live with these things. So in the end, I go back to actually Louis Sullivan, who's the famous American architect and teacher of Frank Lloyd Wright, who wrote that all people are artisans whose destiny is to create a fit, abiding place, a sane and beautiful world. And he meant a non-reductionist world that returns us to unity and harmony and lifts our spirit. And his key here is remember the sea germ, remember that Christic principle in the center, right? And that's his image of it here. So that's my story.
Well, and Steve, that's been an incredible, timeless journey through the.
And thank you very much, Roger.
Stop us here. And,
okay. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your taking the time to
my pleasure.
Offer me this, and you've been very helpful. I know you've been encouraging all along, and many people have. Excuse me.
So, folks, well, you'll see that. You can get the book, Beauty, Memory, and Unity, Steve Bass. You'll see the link there for Amazon. And, we'll keep the comments open on the, so you might get some,
I'll be happy to
we'll post some, like we'll get maybe your email available. So
yes, I can. You have that, actually.
Yeah. So, well, Steve, I'd like to thank you.
Roger, thank you.
Thank you. Incredible
Thank you.
So,
it's been a privilege.
So check out the Academy Sacred Geometry. We've got a few things coming up. We've got our Breakthru-Technologies Theorify Sacred Geometry Conference in Canada next year, 2020. And, we've got ongoing events happening. So check out the website. And you can always join our database to keep in contact. And, if, from time to time, we have sponsorships here in New York with, Steve and some of the other folks in this realm of sacred geometry and beauty, memory, and unity. So thanks, guys, and we'll see you later.
Thank you.